Welcome to the 3D Sketch Modeling Part 1 video, and this video is going to pick up where we left off on Escape Pod episode number 12 entitled Todd Tries to 3D Sketch Model. And of course, this is all based on Escape Pod episode number 11, where we had Pixar modeler Mike Altman join the show to talk about his awesome sketch modeling process. Now before we get started, there was something I did not mention in episode 12, and that was that when you're starting these things out, what's best is to go ahead and select your camera and go through and set the focal length to something like 50 or 60. So once you've done that, this is going to allow you to be able to spin around your object and have less distortion due to camera perspective. So with that done, let's go ahead and jump in. Alright, so this is picking up exactly where that first episode 12 video ended. And what I'm doing here is just modifying some of these spheres because I'm going to be adding some more geometry because I'm going to rebuild this torso because I wasn't happy with it. Now, one thing that's obviously happened here is I'm not showing this real time. This has been sped up. In fact, it's about 400 speed. But this makes it easier to show and talk over as we're kind of working through the process. So as long as you're paying attention to kind of what's going on, you should be able to apply this to just about anything. So here what I'm doing is going through and trying to add some arc to the upper body, to the torso area. And all of this is using those same very simple tools where I'm using things like grabbing vertices and edges and rotating them, removing them, or going to use a lattice. In this case, I decided to go ahead and block in the shoulders as a separate piece of geometry, just because it's simpler and more easily controllable later on. I did not go ahead and add any kind of music or anything to this, figuring that you guys can go ahead and jam out to whatever you want. And when I have something to say, I'll kind of speak up, but that way you've got your own music going and it works much better. I do highly recommend having music on when you do things like this because it does make the time pass really, really fast. So here I just continue to work around this object, and what you'll see throughout the entirety of this video is that it's a constant kind of going back and tweaking what you've already done. As you add something new, you're going to notice something else, and that's what this process is all about. Can you go through and can you match it as close as possible? And that's going to require constant tweaking. As Mike discussed in his video, the pose is really key to all of this. You need to spend enough time up front that you make sure you nail the pose of the character and the proportions. If not, anything else you add on top of this is going to be incorrect and not match up as closely as we would want. And I'm already liking this upper body much better than what I had initially. And you'll find that as you go through, you may need to build something 2 or 3 times before you find a method or a workflow that works. The fun thing is, the next time around you go to do this again, you're going to know those things ahead of time, and you can probably be a little bit more creative with your workflow and nail things in the first attempt or second attempt. Now I'm not going to skip ahead on this video. What I mean by that is I'm not going to start to make edits here. So what you're seeing is actually the entirety of the process all the way from beginning to where this video stops. And I like to do that simply because you can speed ahead if you'd rather just kind of skip ahead and see where things are. But if not, or if you're new to Maya or you're new to learning how to model like this, then you can go ahead and you can watch the entirety and see everything that happens, every step from the beginning of the video to end. So here I'm beginning to rough in the neck. And we're not working, again, obviously we're not working with something that's straight up and down here. We've got a pose already going on this character, which makes sometimes working on some of these shapes a little bit more problematic. This is where you might want to double click on the move tool over in the toolbox and you could select things like object as far as the orientation goes, or normals if you want to scale out your points on your normals. And those are all things that you're going to see me doing here from time to time. Now in this case, I'm beginning to model in what's going to end up being one of her breasts. and getting the shape to be just about right. And again, this character is going to be posed which means her chest is going to be pivoting and turning, so it takes a little bit of time to get these shapes correct. And you're going to see me go through and tweak these quite a bit simply because to get the pose to read correctly, it took me a few attempts to figure out exactly how to lay it out. No matter what, while you're working on these processes and kind of working through your shapes, make sure you keep going back and looking at your reference image. Now, you don't have to necessarily have your reference image in your scene like I do here, and in some cases I might have it off to the side. But I do like to have it in the scene kind of back behind, not directly behind, because I'm not trying to match up to it. Again, I'm eyeballing all of this. Now, one of the things I'm accounting for here is I know she has a strap that comes down and basically cuts across her chest and hooks into her belt. So I'm trying to figure out in my mind, how is this going to work? Because again, if the strap was real, if this is a real character, that strap would have tension on it. It's going to cut through and deform parts of the torso in terms of indenting. So I think I have that section about as good as it's going to get for right now. So what I want to start to think about is, how do these things actually connect? And if you feel underneath your pectoral muscle up into your shoulder, they actually connect on the outside edge. It kind of runs up into your deltoid or into your shoulder. So what I'm doing is just laying in some really simplistic shapes here to kind of help build out those forms. And it may be hard to judge right now, but because this is sped up, you can't see how often I actually stop and pause just a few seconds to basically stare at the reference image back behind and look at my shape. But I'm constantly going back and forth and looking at that. So here I've basically taken the torso area, made another piece directly off of that by grabbing some faces and duplicating them, and this is the beginning of the belt. And for right now, I'm just blocking it in. The shape and the proportions may not be quite right, but it's really important to keep moving through those shapes, because you won't know if everything is correct until you have the majority of the pieces parts roughed in. Here I'm kind of pulling some of the shoulder area back out a little bit further so it hooks in a little bit nicer. But you can see I'm starting to get some of the lines. If you look at her shoulders the way they are in the reference image, her right shoulder, which looks like it's on the left-hand side of our screen, is actually dipped lower than her left shoulder. And I want to make sure those lines read clearly in my pose. Here I'm going through and taking an attempt at the bandana that sits around her neck. And in full disclosure, I built this maybe 2 or 3 different ways before I was happy with the process. And again, as you're doing these things for the first time, you're going to learn how to do certain things and how not to do certain things. It's all part of the learning. So at this point, it looks like a life preserver kind of wrapped around her neck. And now I'm pulling it out just a little bit. And again, I'm using a lattice here. And I've added some extra divisions onto the lattice to make this a little bit simpler. Now the idea, what I was thinking here, was that I could get this thing roughed out, and then I'm going to take some of the thickness or the poofiness of this top out by grabbing this and scaling it down. And you can see how that thinned it out. And then what I'd have to do is go through and maybe add another edge loop or two in there to be able to pull it back up. And there you can see some of that shape. And now it's just some tweaking. So I'm going to go ahead and just start adding a shader onto it so I can see what it looks like, because at this point it's getting a little bit hard to read on some of these. And again, color does change the way you look at things in terms of the reference image. And now is where I really have to start going in and tweaking the underlying shapes, because you can see there's interpenetration where they're kind of poking through. Again, I just kind of roughed some of these things in, so now that I'm adding something else on top of it, especially with articles like clothing, I'm going to have to go in and make sure that everything sits just right. And you can see here I start to wonder, okay, well, what's wrong with these shapes? Well, in this case, the breast is simply too big. It sits too high on her chest, and I can't get the bandana to lay as flat as it looks in the art. Now, again, the art is faked. It's a 2D image, and we're trying to build something in 3D. There's always going to be those changes, but that's the challenge of this particular type of modeling. And right there, I kind of just gave up on that piece, and I said, this isn't working. In fact, I probably hit it. I don't think I actually flat out deleted it. And here I'm going through and thinking about another way I could maybe approach this. Where, what if I just used a blobby shape and it can kind of intersect? But you can see again, without having that little corner edge that sits where the bandana's thickness would be, it doesn't quite work. So this last attempt ends up being the one that sticks. And what I did was I went through and I just created a cylinder, and I deleted the caps on the top and bottom, and now I'm rotating it into position. So I have this ribbon. Now I'm scaling out the bottom of the ribbon, and I'm scaling the top. So I'm fitting it to her neck, kind of angling it so it sits higher on the back of her neck, because her shoulders are going to rise up a little bit. And here I'm playing with a piece that is connective. So imagine that on her chest, if she's wearing a shirt like she's got on, there's going to be some pull in between the breasts, some kind of wrinkling or some kind of pulling of the fabric across that shape. So I'm trying to mimic that right now and trying to figure out ways I could maybe layer this in. Again, this is something I end up changing later on, but I'm working through this, and as you work through, you're going to try things, and some are going to work and some aren't. So with that, I'm going to be able to go back in and lay in the bandana shape. Now, when I look at the way the bandana sits, again, everything on this is skewing up. So if you look at where her left shoulder sits, which is basically the shoulder on her that's the highest, the bandana is pulling to that direction in the concept art. So I need to make sure my bandana on the 3D model also pulls in that direction. And this is where you start to see me weight it towards that side by simply pulling some of these vertice points and shaping it. And now I'm adding in some extra edge loops using the insert edge loop tool, the multi-loop tool, or the multi-cut tool, I'm sorry. And that allows me to kind of sink it down a little bit and get some of that swooping coming off the neck. And like we talked about, every time you tweak something, you have to go back and tweak a lot of other things. This is where those lattices come in handy, but for some things, they're too big. So you have no other choice to really go in and push and pull points. So I'm starting to get much better results with this particular technique. So in terms of clothing and whatnot, or at least for loose clothing like this, a bandana that sits on top of everything else, I'm thinking this is a pretty good technique to carry forward with if I ever run into this again. And here what I'm trying to do is twist everything. So I go ahead and create a lattice because I want to rotate it just a little bit more. Because again, if her shoulder is up quite that high, kind of pulling back, her entire torso is going to basically tweak itself or torque on itself to that side. And that's where using the lattice really comes in handy. Of course, sometimes you forget to include things like the shoulders and you have to go back and redo them. One thing that I mentioned in the other video is line of action. And line of action is a critical idea that is involved in animation posing. It's also involved in just drawing and figure drawing and gesture drawing in terms of having a clean line that goes through your character that defines the action that's taking place. And here the line is going to be starting up from her neck, and it's basically a swooping line that goes down through her front leg, gives her this nice curve. And now my job with the model is to make sure that everything accurately represents that. So again, you can see here I'm tweaking out the shoulder. I'm kind of moving the arm in just a little bit. I'm tweaking her left breast, kind of always looking at that profile to make sure it matches up. And what I'm looking at here is the way her shoulder and her deltoid and her breast, the lines there, again, trying to get the thicknesses just right, to take just enough of the shoulder over the top of the breast. And it just takes constant tweaking. There what you're seeing is actually sometimes in this case I had the top of her shoulder, the deltoid kind of parented to the upper arm, and then if you were to take it and try to move that piece, it actually squirms and kind of grows in different directions. That's called a double transform. In order to move that, I had to unparent it from her arm so it wouldn't get that problem. What's nice is now that I've layered in that bandana, I can really start to see what the chest needs to be like, and I can see how much volume I need to take out of the upper portion of the breast, simply because things don't lay correctly. And here I'm grabbing the outermost edges there, and I'm extruding them in. In this case, I need to cut them back on themselves, so I'm going to grab all of this, and I go in here and I scale it way down and in. Again, that gives me that volume. And then what I did there is add another edge loop using the insert edge loop or multi-cut tool around the very edge of the bandana to give it a little bit of that thickness that I want. And now it's starting to feel more like a piece of cloth. One thing I can also kind of talk about while we're doing this is actually another one of Jeff Harvey's designs. This is for the Escape Pod show King's Aces that we're putting together. So Jeff Harvey did some initial concept art for us of the characters, and this particular character's name is Freeman, very strong African-American woman. And what I did then was take the concept that he had, and I did some redesign work on it simply to make it work for the show and the kind of the performance it needed to give in the show. But that's what we're working off of here. And again, we're looking to have Jeff Harvey on a future iteration or kind of future episode of Escape Pod. And hopefully you guys are having a good time modeling out his different characters that he provided to us for the contest. So here I'm trying to get some more volume in her sternum, trying to pull it forward just a little bit. And I'm also going to go ahead and kind of rotate it a little bit so you can see it's kind of tweaking and twisting on itself. It's the beauty of this modeling technique, and the thing that I'm finding I like the most about it is that kind of anything goes. You don't have to worry about the geometry getting completely destroyed, because the only way I'm really looking at it is in smooth. I'm not looking at the low resolution or the straight up polygon version, because if I did, it would probably look pretty terrible. Again, now I'm just really looking at that bandana, trying to make sure that that back side feels a little bit shortened like it is in the image, and the front side feels like it's pulling over to the side. I'm going to worry about all the little details inside of there later, and that'll be stuff that I add on top. I'm planning on doing it exactly like Mike was showing on some of his sketch lines. I should also mention that this particular image that I'm using isn't quite as sketchy as what Mike was using. Which I'm seeing now, obviously why he might like using the more sketchy is because you have more lines to play off of. In this case, it's more painterly, but I'm going to be going through and experimenting a little bit in the shading process with getting some of the shadowing that's happening there. And here I just decided to get rid of that piece altogether, because the real problem is that her chest isn't coming out far enough, the sternum. And what I'm going to do next is try to layer in the belt piece that's in there. So she has a strap that comes down between her breasts and connects into her belt. And I feel like at this point, without that, I can't go through and get a good measure of what the real problems may be. So like I've been saying, keep working through. Just keep adding geometry. You can go back, you can tweak, but a lot of cases you need something to reference in order to clearly define or see if something is actually working. Kind of rotating this a little bit so it sits correctly on her torso there. Now I do still have that big kind of thick, it looks like it's a big chunk of geometry at the bottom of the bandana there where the belt hits. But you can see if I start to pull this breast over, it makes sense, and it kind of fills in that area that other piece of geometry was trying to kind of give me. And now it feels like that the belt piece is cutting between the two breasts into her belt. Again, just kind of tweaking out some of these connective bits. And I want to reiterate at this point, again, I've been saying this a little bit here and there, but this is the very first time I'm trying this process. Never built one of these before, just decided after seeing Mike's stuff how I thought it was super awesome and super amazing, some of the coolest modeling stuff I've seen in a long time. So I just wanted to jump in and try it. So like you, if you're trying this out right now, I'm just making it up as I go. Now I've gotten to the point where I think I have enough of it roughed in that I really want to start to put some shaders on here, because again, that'll really give me a good indication of whether something is too short, if it's too long, if it's what the problems are. And these are just really simple Lambert shaders that I'm putting on right now, that I'm sampling the color from the image. So now the parts that I started with, I'm going back and refining. Feels like her pelvis is a little bit too big or too thick, so I'm trying to take some of the mass out of it. And what I'm really looking at is that there's a round, the connection between her thigh and her pelvis, that I'm trying to match that I see in the concept art. Where it almost looks like one continuous piece, and right now I still have the distinction. There's a little bit of a valley that forms up where the two pieces connect, but I'll account for that later on. I would say at this point, now that I'm kind of watching this after the fact, I think I see this later on, but it's pretty clear her legs are still a little bit too big. They need to be scaled down, but I'll get there. Now we're kind of tweaking out the bandana just a little bit more. Working on those connections where they come together. I'm just going to have them jam right into each other there. Okay, so now we're going to have some fun. On the back of this, what I'm going to do is, again, using a technique that Mike had showed. I'm taking a piece I already have, I duplicated it, and I'm going to make this the shirt portion of her shoulders, and then I'm going to use the other piece, the original piece, and I'm going to shade it her skin tone so it looks like there's skin underneath it. So here you can see I'm going back and forth between the two pieces. This is going to be the piece that sticks in terms of her skin. You can see how it comes out underneath her arm a little bit, giving her some trap. I'm going to take this piece here. I duplicate it as well. I scale it out on the normals, and that's where I grab my normals and I kind of scale them using the move tool. I'm sorry, I move them using the move tool on normal. And I cut this using the multi-cut tool at the angle that I wanted. So now you can see it kind of sits almost like the bottom. It's kind of like a ripped sleeve, so I don't mind the shearing that's happening underneath her arm. What I'm going to do now, though, is take this piece, I pull it back just a little bit. I'm going to sink that other part in that I had originally. Grab this, I'm going to blow a hole in it, and then grab it and extrude it down. Again, kind of similar to what I did for the bandana. Now I add two extra edges, and I cut on both sides of that one edge, and I delete out the original one, and now I'm kind of moving it forward. And again, if this is going too fast, you can always back up and watch it multiple times. But that's an instance where I took something that was existing, duplicated it, scaled it up just a little bit, took the piece underneath, made it into her skin tone, took the piece that I scaled up that was bigger than your duplicate, blew a hole in the end of it, kind of extruded in the edges just a little bit, cut them once or twice, and now I've got what looks like a shirt. And here I'm just tweaking. Just filling in gaps where I see them. So now you can see some of the connective tissue that's kind of coming off the deltoid that goes underneath her pectoral muscle there. You can see her shoulder. I'm going to do the same thing on this opposite side. And again, I can't use symmetry right now because this is nowhere near symmetrical. So I'm cheating this all over the place. So on this side, I have to do the exact same process. So we're going to blow a hole in the end here. Again, in this case, I didn't actually delete the faces. I just grabbed them, hit extrude. Now I got to go in and add another edge loop here. And that helps to just kind of firm up those edges. Here I didn't like the edge loop I placed, so I placed two edge loops, one on both sides, and then deleted the original. And now I'm just shaping it out. And again, keep looking at that reference image. I keep going back to it here because I want to make sure I see her shoulder. If you look at this particular reference image on the back side, on this side that I'm working on right now, you don't really see any of the shirt. It kind of goes right into the bandana. So I need to make sure my model does the same thing. Maybe something like that. Now it looks like the bandana's overhanging it. Again, a few little tweaks here and there. Now I got to come in and tweak some of this up here, simply because as I moved some things around, I wasn't quite happy with what was happening there any longer. And now we've got that. It's almost like you can't be happy with anything until you're happy with everything. That's why you keep seeing me go back to the legs and tweak them. Again, there's going to be some bigger tweaks that I make there in a moment. But now it's time to start roughing in the head. And what I found on this particular bit is that my drawing is cheated quite a bit. I don't have things like the jawline quite right, and there's no kind of brow ridge that's distinguishable on the outside of the of her face and whatnot, which would be there. So on my model, I'm having trouble, I run into trouble where I'm trying to replicate what's there, but if I make it too close, it doesn't look right in 3D, so I'm going to have to kind of modify things a little bit. And again, the point is to make it feel and look just like that image, but in this case, I may have to make a few little adjustments here or there. And you can see I made the top of the head, and now I'm making the jaw, and it's very similar to if you were to go in and kind of draw a character out. In this case, the jaw is still too thick. You're going to see me consistently going and thinning it out. But if you look at her face, what I'm doing is pulling her jaw over to one side. Again, what I want is a line of action. And you can kind of see that in the reference image behind it, where if you look at the nose to the mouth, they're at an angle. They're kind of cockeyed from one another. They're kind of pulled off to the side. So when I look at the face of this character, if I was looking at it straight on, what I want is a curve that comes down from her forehead and kind of curves off to her left. And you'll be able to see that once I get the nose really placed in there. So here I'm just kind of roughing in the ear. Again, notice how many times I've used that little sphere, and that's one of the best things that Mike talked about in his talk that he gave in the episode number 11, was basically how much you can get away with just using a cube that's been smoothed once. It's pretty awesome. And where those two, you can see the intersection line between those two right now. That's going to be my eye line. So that's what I'm judging right now, is that's going to where the eye is going to fall. And now what I'm doing is kind of pulling her jaw forward a little bit, kind of sharpening it. Taking the back here and kind of scaling it up just a little bit to make her neck a little bit bigger. And you've seen me do this trick a couple times now, where if I need a little bit more of a curve to it, I'll draw a line on either side or insert edge loop on either side of the original curve, and then I'll get rid of that edge line. Now the trick here with her face too is that her chin sits on top of the bandana, so it feels like she's pulling her chin back towards her body. She's making such a strong effort with this chain that her neck, her chin is basically compressed back towards her neck. And I'll end up adding some more detail to these ears later on. It won't happen in this particular video, but you'll see it here, because I want to get all those little shapes too. But right now it's about the big stuff. And you can see right there, I'm really pushing her head down. She's really making a strong effort. When I do that though, notice the neck has to come forward. Her head is also kind of squatty, and I think mine was a little bit too tall, so I'm just going to put everything into a lattice, and I start to pull down those upper points, and it kind of flattens it out just a little bit. Constantly looking at that reference image. You may also have noticed at some point in my viewport, some of the menu stuff went away, and it's simply because I hit some kind of button someplace in Maya. I didn't realize it till later on. So if you see me toggle between wireframe unshaded and not having wireframe unshaded pulled up, all I'm doing is simply holding down the space bar and going into the menus there. but later on it will pop back up when I correct it. Not a big deal, I just wanted to mention it in case you noticed it or thought I did something. To me, that little twist on her face makes a huge deal. It's a big difference than if it was totally just straight up and down. In 3D, if it was going to be animated, nothing stays straight up 3D or straight up and down. The animators will go in and kind of tweak it and pull it again using all those principles of animation. And any good concept design too has some of that element in it. So what am I trying to do here? Well, I'm trying to make a brow ridge. Actually, I take that back. Right now I'm working on the nose. So I'm going to be going through and just kind of, it's almost like a button nose approach that I'm using here, just to kind of place the beginnings of the ball of the nose, and then I'll go through and deal with the nostrils here in a bit. So there I tried to pull up the back thinking I could have it arc just a little bit, but I'm going to end up using a separate piece of geometry for that because again, if I can get away with just ramming stuff together, it makes it much simpler. So now I'm working on the bridge of the nose and kind of roughing that in, kind of angling it back. The bridge kind of should cut into where the eye line kind of sits and then up into the brow. But her face and the concept is pretty flat. It's almost like her eyes and stuff sit on, it's not a flat plane, but her face as a whole is kind of a rounded or a bent flat plane. So I don't have that much in the way of facial details to pull from. It's a fairly graphic, fairly simple design. There you see me get tired of having the legs be quite so big. So I finally went in and kind of took some of the volume out of them, scaled them down a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is take this line and I redrew it and slid it back because the upper part of her leg should be a little bit bigger, but I thought having that division there right in the middle was too much. It needed to go back. It kind of it makes it more pointy. And I think that automatically starts to feel good. And now I'm looking at the overall of her back. And is it arced the right way? Is her torso too long? Is it too short? And I think she's maybe a bit too upright, like her shoulders and that maybe even her chest or breasts could be rotated back just a little bit to make it look like she's pulling it even harder. And that's what I'm trying to do here. There was that same little problem where I had that deltoid parented, but I didn't grab it when I did the lattice work that I was doing, and the same thing happened on the opposite side, so now I have to go back and just reposition those. It's kind of shaping out the nose. Way too boxy. But it's starting to feel like a face. And now I'm going to start working on the nostrils. So again, just grabbing that poly quad ball that I've got sitting off to the side, smooth it out, and I'm just going to shape it, pushing and pulling points and using the lattice. Exact same thing that we've been doing. And here, for whatever reason, I went through and I must have either keyframed or it hit something that added some kind of constraint or something. So I had to go through and grab everything and break all the connections on it just to make sure. Not a big deal. That's just, I wanted to tell you what was happening there. All right, so I got that other side kind of set in. And this is where I start trying to think about the brow ridge. And I go through and I try to layer this up. And again, your brow ridge sits above your eyes. It comes out from about your cheek line. So in a lot of cases, I think Mike even showed this in some of his. It was a separate piece and he had it roughed in. The problem I kept running into with this, though, is it didn't match the concept art. And again, the concept art is pretty heavily cheated. So I didn't like the forms and the shapes that I was getting from it. So I tried a couple different things here, and eventually I just deleted it and took the top of the head the way I already had it and kind of pulled some of the points to make that brow ridge more pronounced. And here you can see me doing that. Shortening the nose up just a little bit. Now that I've kind of that ridge where I want it. And here I'm making the eyeball. And what I did on this is I took the eyeball, I made a new shader, put it on it, and I cranked up the ambient attribute on it, which basically takes some of the shadowing off. Again, something else that Mike discussed in his talk that he gave. And you can see as soon as you pop the eyes in there, it starts to come to life. And even though they're not quite the right shape, the eyes on this character are really cheated as well. They're triangular, which I'm going to have to figure out exactly how I'm going to do that. But for right now, it feels right. But now I can start to judge the nose based on the eyes. It looks like maybe her jaw has to come back just a little bit. Kind of play with some of the shapes. Just keep working through it. But little by little, she's starting to come into focus. Now I'm worrying about that back edge. And again, it's almost like one clean edge in the artwork. There's no indentation. There's no cut-in where her brow ridge and her cheeks kind of meet like you would see on a normal character in 3D. So I'm trying to compensate for that. And my guess is I'll end up with a little something there just to make the 3D model work. But we'll see what happens. So now it's time to make her hat. So here I'm going to use what I learned on the bandana and just start off with a polycylinder. And I'm getting it to about the right thickness. And I keep judging this based on the right angle. Now it almost reads as a flat line. And I know it's going to have some thickness to it. But I want to maintain that where it's like razor sharp, it's straight across. That's part of the style of this particular piece of artwork. And now I'm building out the center of the hat just by taking the original piece and duplicating it. But it creates an interesting problem for me, and that's the fact that this character's head is cheated. It has this hat on its head, but the top of the hat is actually smaller than the top of her head. So here I'm trying something where I grab the head, put it in a lattice, and try to crush it down. But what it does is actually crushes the shape of the geometry, so that's not going to work. So now what I'm going to do is just use my multi-cut tool, and I basically draw in some edges around the top, keeping like a little buffer edge all the way around. Now I'm going to grab all of this and delete it, and then come back in, grab all of this, extrude it up, and then I'm going to push and pull points to make sure it sits inside the hat. And now I've cut it. So now our hat basically magically stops her head from passing through it. And you can see though, as I position things, I'm going to have to go in and reposition those points on her head. Tried using the lattice there. It wasn't going to work because of the angle of the points. But her hat also has a slope on the front, but the back is straight up. Again, kind of a graphic element. So I'm just kind of roughing this in the best I can right now. And I'm going to go ahead and leave that stuff sit the way it is. And now I'm going to worry about the volumes of her hair, because I think once I have those volumes of her hair, the rest of this is going to come into focus much easier. And I'm going to end up going through later on and making the smaller little shapes that you can see on the outside of the silhouette. But for right now, I'm just worried about the big volume of making sure it reads properly. And then I can change it all later. So to do this, I'm just taking those spheres and I'm basically scaling them, kind of squishing them just a little bit, and then rotating them at different directions so they kind of layer up on top of each other. Now, when I get up to the top, what I'm doing is grabbing those top points, I crush them down using the scale tool, and now I'm rotating them. So it basically has a flat top on it, and now I can just crush them right up against the hat, which creates that nice little effect. And in a second here, I start to learn some problems with the head shape where I think her jaw goes back too far, her ear. Again, it's only by roughing in this hair that I start to see some of those things. I want to make sure I have a nice clean line around the ear. Now I'm worried about the little hook of hair that she has that comes down in front of her ear. It's got a really definite shape to it, like a half spiral shape, and I want to make sure I nail that here, because that's going to tell me if her ear is sitting in the proper place on her head relative to the art. And I'm just going to take a lattice right now. I added some extra divisions to it, so I could go ahead and I could just take this piece and shape it a little bit quicker. And here you can see I start to play with the ear and scale it down a little bit. I think it was too big, too wide. And I even go in and start to play with the neck just a little bit because I think it was sitting in the wrong spot. Again, just kind of shaping some of the head just a little bit. I'm not worried about the intersection at the top there where the head's kind of sticking up through the hat. I'll deal with all that once I have the hat and hair all set the way I want. So the next thing I want to do, and the last part that's going to happen I think on this video, is to go through and do the opposite side of the hair, because again that allowed me to judge the opposite side of the model to make sure it's staying on model. Before I do that, tweak the neck just a little bit more. And just kind of move some of these things forward again, kind of filling in some of those gaps. This is one thing that I did spend just a few seconds on here, and that's trying to maintain these really sharp, clean lines. If you look here, the way the hair is falling, it creates almost like a little cut-in on that bandana. If you look at the artwork, it's almost razor sharp. It's razor clean in terms of the way it kind of arcs right up from her neck off her shoulder, and you can see it right here in this image. So what I'm trying to do is adjust the hair volumes that I have, because I don't like that little hiccup that happens just as it comes off her neck. And what I found was by using one bigger shape like that, it now makes that nice clean line that I was looking for. And hopefully you can see that. right there. And it looks like in the artwork that the bandana overhangs almost over her shoulder on the other side where I don't see any of the shirt. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is just kind of get the bandana tweaked relative to what I do with the head. Here I'm actually going through and starting to make the shirt kind of tears. So I just created a cube. I flattened the cube, added a couple divisions into it using the insert edge loop tool or the multi-cut tool, and I'm just kind of layering these things in. I'm going to sharpen them all up here in a few seconds, but right now I just want to try to get this thing layered in, get the angle to look about right, and make sure that this type of process I'm using or the approach that I'm using is going to work. So once I have one, I just duplicate it, and again, just to rough it out, I kind of place this one. They almost feel like feathers right now. They're not sharp enough, so that's what you're going to see me doing here, is kind of sharpening them all up. Kind of rotating them, getting them to angle. Just looking at the reference image, trying to match the shapes. And I would advise against doing this this to me is not large shape work anymore. This is getting more towards detail stuff. But I wouldn't do that until you're at the point where you feel like all of your major elements are there, at least fairly close to being there, and then start to add this kind of secondary level of shape and form. So I deleted the back faces off of there so they don't try to round over. And I'm going to do that to the other two I created as well. It just sharpens up the forms a little bit. Keeps them from being quite so gummy. Just looking at some of the angles on these and making sure they feel like they're twisting and turning, but that the profile still matches what's in the artwork. Now I'm finally going to go do the opposite side of her hair like we had talked about. So I got to remember to tweak the ear. Remember, I tweaked the ear positioning and placement on the opposite side, so now I need to do it on this side as well. And what I'm looking at here, she has two really big shapes on that side of her head in terms of her hair. There's like two big, it almost looks like an M shape if you look at the silhouette of it. So I'm using my flattening trick again, kind of lining this first one up. And then I'm going to go ahead and deal with this second one. And I'm placing just a bigger volume back behind. Again, just trying to fill in some space here. Just duplicating the little hook of hair that I have on the opposite side. I'll probably go through later on and modify this so they're not exactly the same. Maybe one will come down just a little bit lower. It'll make for a more interesting turntable later on. And now I'm just kind of tweaking this piece right here so I can get it to sit just beyond the silhouette of the ear. So we're going to stop this video right here. Again, this is a pretty long video to begin with, but if you look around this, we've got a lot of it blocked in already. I think the overall look and feel of things feels about right in terms of how closely it relates to this concept. There's a few things here or there that I can already see that I'm going to want to tweak. The angle of her upper body may be off just a little bit. I'd like to lean her back just ever so slightly. Getting this area right there, again, if I look at here, it's one continuous clean shape. Again, it's probably impossible to do simply because this has been cheated so much, but I think if I kick her hip out just a little bit further, I can probably start to do some of that. I may kick this leg in just a little bit, going through and kind of modifying it. But we'll see what happens with it. I'll keep playing with it. My hope is that this was helpful to you. Again, if you like these videos, hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you subscribe to Escape Pod. We plan on doing a lot more stuff like this, and we'll be putting together a second video in this series dealing with sketch models really soon. So keep an eye out for it. In the meantime, jump in and start doing some sketch modeling.